92nd Street Y would like to thank THNKR for everything they've done to create such a high-value, meaningful event. And the 92Y looks forward to future endeavors and programming with THNKR. Our moderator tonight is an award-winning journalist, author, and blogger who has written about education, social issues, politics, and gender for more than 20 years. She has written about the online education landscape for the New York Times and the Harvard Education Letter, in addition to devoting one of her books, Inside School Turnarounds, to the larger topic of education. She has moderated in other places, but this is the first time she has moderated here. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me and welcome Laura Pappano.
Welcome and thank you for being here. Hopefully we're going to have a great and lively discussion. I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists here. We have, right to my right here, we have Joe Hall, who is with
Ghetto Film School.
Thank you. And why don't we go, and Jake Schwartz?
Hi, I'm Jake Schwartz. I'm the co-founder and CEO of General Assembly.
Yay.
Yay.
Woohoo! My name is Abigail Besdin, and I lead the education team at Skillshare.
Hi, my name is Joel Rose. I'm the co-founder and CEO of New Classrooms Innovation Partners.
Great. I want to frame the discussion here by saying that we're here to talk about really a new sensibility in education. And traditionally, we framed education reform in the kind of K-12 world and thinking about standards-based movement and trying to fill the achievement gap. And there's been progress, but it's not been enough really for the cultural effort we put in, for the financial effort we put in. And what we have now in education is what we've never really intended, which is a heavy emphasis on test scores and flattening of the curriculum. And at the higher education level, we have questions about whether or not graduate degrees matter, whether or not a college degree even matters. And what's funny about this is at the same moment, we have this tremendous opportunity. We have the rise of online. We have comfort with social media. We have Wikipedia, we've got Google, we've got YouTube, we've got Khan Academy, and we've got the rise of the massive open online course. And it used to be that these courses and these online education was what we used to call in education distance education. It used to be far away and kind of not so critical. And now it's in our face, it's present, and we're involved with it. And this has created a situation where online is not second rate anymore. It's a way of sharing, it's a way of learning, and tonight we're going to talk about some of what this means. It's also disaggregating and disordering what we think of by education. And this is a conversation we had a little bit in the green room of the kind of steps that we think of that are education. Many of us have marched from kindergarten to 12th grade to college to graduate school in very particular ways, really worrying all the time about fitting a pre-prescribed path. That's changed. And it's raising fundamental questions like, what is learning? And it's handed power to new stakeholders. It's handed power to you, to all of these guys, to me, to our kids. Now, there are problems. Some of the tech stuff doesn't work. The uses are still evolving. Some tools don't do what inventors imagined they would. And schools may not be able to afford to use all of these things. And yet, this movement is bringing fresh eyes to old assumptions. And included in that are the structure of classrooms, or the order of lessons, or what skills matter. It's no longer enough to check off a box. The college degree is in doubt, and the question is, what is a worthwhile credential? Can you fix stuff? Can you demonstrate skills? Can you be creative? These are some of the questions that we're asking now. So we're in transition, and we're going to have a great conversation tonight about really what we're all trying to understand, and that is, what is the future of education? Now, the structure for this evening is, I know there will be cards going around. We would encourage you to jot down questions as we go. We will talk for a little bit, and then we will kick off and have some audience questions. And hopefully we'll leave here with some, maybe not answers, but some more ideas than everyone came with. So I just want to start off as a way of just asking each of you to describe what is the biggest problem in education, and what is it that you're trying to solve? What piece of it are you trying to solve? Do you want to start over there?
Sure. So when we think about the biggest problem we're trying to solve, it begins with a guy named Horace Mann. He grows up in Massachusetts at a time where there's this tremendous tension between Catholics and Protestants, and he makes it his life's mission to create a more tolerant, civilized society. So for inspiration, he gets on a boat with his wife, and he goes to Prussia, where he sees one teacher and about 30 kids in a box. And he goes, aha, I've seen it. This is what we need back in Massachusetts, because this is what will teach Protestant kids and Catholic kids to coexist. And this becomes the blueprint for how we do K-12 the way we do K-12 today. This was in 1843. And the one thing that we know today that we're sure he didn't know back in 1843 is that kids are all different. You can't just assume that all kids are the same. If you walk into a 6th grade class, you've got kids on a 4th grade level and kids on an 8th grade level, and the batched process classroom just doesn't accommodate the needs of each student each day. And so what we're trying to solve is to create an entirely new delivery model that isn't about throwing 3 computers in the back of the classroom, but it's about reimagining the classroom in ways that are mindful of what technology can do, mindful of what great teachers can do, and in a way that is actually much more personalized to the needs of each student each day.
Great. Abigail?
One of the biggest problems that we see ourselves trying to solve is figuring out how to distinguish learning from education. So you'll hear us probably use the words pretty interchangeably over the next hour or so. But for us, we see education as a system that's centralized and it's linear. It is a means to a very specific end, which is a degree. And, you know, blessing in disguise, what happened with the economy in the last few years, I think people started to look up from that process and sort of ask themselves, well, you know, if this was the means, what was really the end? If they didn't get the job, if they were still struggling, if they didn't really feel that they had learned very much. So Skillshare basically, you know, the mission in really, really short is you should never stop learning. You should be learning always when your education is over. So when you've finished figuring out what you want to do for a living, that's not actually an excuse to finish developing, growing, either professionally or just as, you know, passionate side projects.
Great. Jake?
So General Assembly was really founded on the thesis that while liberal arts is really the core of the American higher educational system, those institutions don't do really a great job and aren't really necessarily capable of giving students the skills they need to be competitive in the 21st century, and that we as a country need to be competitive in the 21st century. And so what we do is really create you know, 10 to 12-week courses that are really focused on giving students those skills that can complement their liberal arts education and allow them to get employment and be competitive in sort of the modern workforce.
I would say one problem in education is always talking about education as a problem and sort of defining it as glass half full. And I think certainly in New York City, that discussion is also driven by the fact that the majority of the students are non-white. And so it's very easy to talk about being at risk and disadvantaged and the problems inherent in the system. And so almost all discussions around education are not highlighting what's actually working, and also the extraordinary assets and resources that are in the public education system, which was a system designed a long time ago, certainly in New York City, to move people out of poverty, to actually be this great equalizer in a democracy, whereas now we hear that you can't really teach kids who come from a poor home. And so there's a big shift in how we even have the discussion that I think limits us in terms of what is actually possible, and it also limits the expectations that we have of students, particularly students of color in the New York City public school system.
So what I'm hearing from each of you is really a challenge to structure, whether it's the structure of the classroom, the structure of education, whether it's K-12 or whether it's higher ed. I just want to dig into that just a little bit and have each of you really share a little bit about, do we not need any structure? Should we have an educational kind of free-for-all? What structures in education do matter? Which structures are you pushing against that you think are limiting?
Well, if I could take that from the higher ed side, I mean, I think we think a lot about this actually, and it's not that there's not, like, structure is a weird word to put on it, right? Because what we're really talking about is purpose. Mm-hmm. And for me, when I look at higher educational system in the United States, we are trying to stuff so many purposes into one box, and it's where the problem comes on. So when somebody goes to college, especially, if it happens to be in one of these top 200 colleges, and as you call it, green and all this, we have this expectation in our culture that it serves three specific goals. One is that it's essentially a coming-of-age ritual. It's a babysitting of a young adult into becoming more of a real adult. Number two is that it expands people's minds with critical thinking and liberal arts and makes them a better citizen of the world. I don't disagree with it, but that's purpose two. And purpose three is that it prepares you for your economic life, right? And so there is no reason that institutions should be expected to deliver on all of those three goals at the exact same time. There's no reason why we need programs that deliver on all those three goals at the same time. It's really an offshoot of what college was to a very, very select elite in the 19th century, and that became sort of exploded in the 20th century as state school systems were developed, and the GI Bill kind of just really put gas on the fire.
But if you're really going to focus on the purpose piece, is the coming of age stuff not a good idea?
Oh, it's great, but why does it have to happen at the same time? Why can't you go have a coming of age experience followed by an economic preparation experience, and then do liberal arts training throughout your entire life? This is a little bit of what Skillshare is talking about. Is like, why is only when I'm 19 a good time to read the Odyssey, right? Why is
because you have time, right?
Because you have time, but that's because you have the time because you're supposedly being given that time so that later you can go and get a job in the workforce.
Okay. Now Joel though is doing work to really. Joel is recognizing that kids need specific skills, that it isn't kind of an educational free-for-all, but they can get them in different ways. Can you talk a little bit about how this intersects with this piece?
Sure. It's funny. Most panels I'm on, I'm like the cutting edge guy. Here, I'm like the dinosaur. So it's funny. Look, there are structures that we think are really good. We think, and we work with middle school kids, standards matter. We think good teachers matter. So the question is that it's the delivery model that is the challenge, that just having one teacher, 30 kids in a room with the textbook and a sort of standard grade level curriculum doesn't really work. I mean, there are millions of kids, 6th graders, that walk into a 6th grade class on the first day of school and are operating on a 4th grade level. And we say, here's your 6th grade textbook, here's your 6th grade teacher, good luck. Right? And they're already in a hole. And then every day their hole gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And then we say, well, why is there an achievement gap? And why don't we hold that teacher accountable for outcomes? So the question in my mind isn't, so we just throw school out because it doesn't work? No. I think we can accomplish the goals of what formal schools are trying to accomplish. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to show that outcomes of high school graduation, college graduation correlate to meaningful life outcomes down the road. We're just having a hard time delivering that at scale to enough kids. So the question is, how do we rethink the delivery of that without necessarily throwing out
and so
the whole
rethink
idea?
The delivery, what does that concrete look like in a classroom?
So in our classroom, if you're a 7th grader, you've got reading first period in room 205. You have second PE second period in the gym. Third period you have math. And instead of going into room 206, we've knocked down the walls between rooms 206 and 211 to create a large open space. In that space, there's 12 or 13 different stations. Some stations, kids work with teachers. Some stations, they work collaboratively on projects. Some stations, they work with virtual tutors located anywhere around the world. Some stations, they work with software. And above each station, there's a sign. This is Yankee Stadium. This is the Bronx Zoo. And when you walk in, you see a big monitor that looks like the monitors you see at the airport. And you see your name, and you see which station you're supposed to go to. So you might spend the first 30 minutes working on an area of a triangle with Mr. Smith. Then you might spend the next 30 minutes working on an area of a triangle with some software. Then you spend the last 10 minutes taking an online assessment in an area of a triangle, and then you're off to science. We then take the data from that daily assessment and create your schedule for the next day based on how you did the previous day.
So if someone is struggling with triangles with Mr. Smith, then they will get extra triangles with Mr. Smith? Okay.
They'll move on. Whereas in a typical class, if Mr. Smith teaches triangles and half the kids get it and half the kids don't, what does he do? The next day, does he bore half the kids, or does he dig the hole deeper?
So the teachers are having to adjust day by day by day.
Well, we provide them with plenty of tools and resources to make that process fairly seamless.
Okay, so a very customized look at approach.
Exactly.
Very individualized. And I would suggest probably, Joe, that you probably are doing individualized, but in a different way.
Yeah, first I want to say if Joel knocked down a wall in a public school, he is truly badass. Like, that is amazing. Because getting a fax line, you know, in a big system sometimes is very difficult. What we found, you know, when we set out, we were really trying to address a diversity issue in film through our nonprofit programs, and we had worked over years in about 30 different schools that would hire us. And what we found was there was something about a collaborative activity that was based in creativity, that had a kind of ripple effect. And I think one thing is true in all strong schools, no matter where you are, is not so much the curriculum that they're using, but it's the school culture. You know, how do they celebrate success? What are the rituals? What are the practices? What are the things that enhance the relationship? And so when I hear something about Joel's project, what I'm really focused on is how that enhances the relationship between the teacher and these adolescents. Because when you're talking about teenagers, they're this combustible mix of hormones and personalities, and wondering, you know, does Jenny really like me or not like me? You know, like, all these things are happening, and you need that teacher to make that through. But in the filmmaking process, that is a big part of the high school we started 4 years ago, which is imbued throughout the entire school. As someone once said to me, it's a collaborative industrial art form, and there's a lot that happens around problem solving. There's a lot that happens around getting, as I said once before, the owner of the bodega on your block to use it as a set. You know, a lot of the things that Daniel Pink talks about the skills that you need in the 21st century are really happening if you're exposed to that as a 14 or 15-year-old. But most importantly, when you are learning things that's based on your creative idea, and you're trying to advance your own idea, you take ownership and responsibility of that process in a very different way than if you're being told, here are the facts and figures, and on Friday we're going to have a test, and then we're going to decide if you're smart or not. And when that is in a school that has a strong culture with high expectations of those students, then I think you start to see.
So do you have any stories or any specific examples of how this has changed a vision of school for a kid in your school?
Well, I think from the beginning it validates that their idea is what we're moving towards. So
it's not they're trying to meet a particular set of curriculums or get to the aha moment that the teachers kind of planted there in
Correct.
the 30 minutes into the lesson.
In 2000, when I was doing a lot of research on what were called youth media organizations, there were about 250 in the country at the time, I was really struck by the fact that they were all doing documentary. And I love documentaries, but I thought it would be much more interesting to have young kids writing a narrative script. And so when the idea comes from them, rather than sort of documenting what is in their community, and by the way, they're oftentimes led to document something that is a negative perception, right, which reinforces their sense of they are the victim, they're at risk, they're disadvantaged. You know, there's a really pernicious effect to that over time. But when they are learning things that are based on, I've created this idea, this story, and now I'm trying to put that story out into the world, it's a whole different posture. You know, it's a whole different relationship between them and their learning process, but also that community, whether that's an audience or their teachers or the students in the...
So this idea of being driven towards some kind of learning, I mean, I think one of the interesting things about this whole movement is that we've had this revelation that one doesn't finish kind of school and then you're done for the rest of your life. And I think, Abigail, if you could just give us an idea of what are some of the kind of most interesting things that you've seen about what people are coming to you for and what they want out of Skillshare. I mean, certainly you can set up something, but how people use it is often more telling.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect segue. I feel like you guys are lobbing us students 10 years from now that are the perfect candidates to take classes on Skillshare, which is wonderful. It's the same model. So it's generate the idea, feel really passionate and invested in it, and collaborate to see it through to its end. So to answer your question, people are coming to us because they're hungry for that experience. So they are not expressing themselves creatively, they're not flexing their creative muscles. They've sort of stopped learning. I can't say that any more dramatically. They've literally stopped trying to learn new skills. And the way that our classes are structured is they're online, they're all project-based. And the project is, here's where you need to be 3 weeks from now, figure out how you want to get there and who you want to get there with. So an example that I love to use is a class on digital illustration that could technically be a tutorial in the tool Illustrator, is instead a prompt to communicate something quiet or loud through illustration. Mm-hmm. We have thousands of students from all over the world passing through this class, and each one of them has interpreted it differently. They've each produced a project that looks nothing like the other students' projects, and they've clustered up into groups of either 2 or up to 20 or 30 students problem solving the issue of the definition of the word quiet, for example. They're coming to us because they either have never had that experience or missed that experience having had it when they were very young or maybe coming of age years.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing is a passion for creativity from everyone, that students want and almost are demanding now to be creative in what they do. And at the same time, I'm hearing that we need to make sure that we have the right skills that are job skills, and we need to have the standards that meet the standards. How does an education system how do you put it together so that you have creativity and is it grinding creativity, or is it possible that they are intermingled? Is it possible to make the skills that one must have to get a job, the middle school math skills? I mean, I don't know how many people loved middle school math. Anyone out there? I mean, so is there a tension between creativity and these standards?
I think, at least when we're starting to talk, I mean, and I don't know about middle school math, but I think middle school math from when I took it could definitely be more creative than how they taught it then. But in general, what we find is the skills that people need, right? That at least in our little privileged New York City world of digital ecosystem and things like that, the skills are mostly creative skills, not necessarily in that it's totally freeform, writing a screenplay all the time, but that they are creating something as part of their job. And the output of their job is to have created something at the end of it. Okay, so purpose and result. Purpose. Yes. Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I do, but I also think that this comes together in something called design. And it really is about course design. So when students are engaged in our model, they spend about 60% of their time learning these discrete skills and about 30% on multi-day projects that have these skills embedded within them. So one of the projects, for example, is at the end of a 2-week period, students have to present to their classmates whether or not they should buy a hybrid car and why. And before that, there may have been lessons on rate equals distance times time and miles per gallon and tax rebates and all the things that would allow them to decide what their answer is and to defend their answer. That doesn't mean that you're not teaching core skills as part of that, nor does it mean you're not creating. But what is required is a design that basically captures both ends of the spectrum and not choosing between one or the other.
So you need the 3 R's, but I also think that education now has to address the fact that you cannot predict what these folks are doing. I mean, when we brought this concept of a film, of high school based in filmmaking, to the Department of Education, right away they said, oh, it's great because there's a $7 billion a year television and film industry and we're going to create this. And I said, first of all, it's nuts to ask an 8th grader what they're going to do for the rest of their life, especially in an environment now, in a landscape in the United States where the rate of change is so dramatic. I mean, you cannot have job training and workforce development where you're preparing someone for a specific job, let alone you can't even prepare them for a field because we don't know in 5 years what fields are still going to be around. So you have to learn skills that are collaborative, project-based, emphasizing certain things like empathy. So in our school, you do need the 3 R's, and you need to learn those basic skills, but you're also going to have to learn something in that collaborative process that is transferable to whatever you're going to do. So it's not occupational specific.
Is there a vocational or trade, and I'm not using this as a pejorative term at all, because our whole mission is to raise that idea, but so there's no trade element. Like, how many of the kids who are going to graduate do you think are going to go to film school or go out and try to get a job in film or make films throughout their college experience? Like, what's your sort of take on it?
Isn't your point that film is about seeing and understanding and thinking?
Correct. And it's about creating something, it's about working in a way that is going to prepare you for all kinds of jobs. I mean, so I would say in this first graduating class, I mean, the school was announced, the end of February. People had already decided where they're going to school. So I don't know how many of those kids, I would say in the 9th grade, you're talking about probably more than half see that as a destination. Whether or not they do that, I think they're still going to be well served by having those abilities. And also having some ability to apply aesthetics and design. And that, I always say, Mark Zuckerberg did not invent a new technology, but his genius was really in putting together the aesthetic template for that and really making these really astute decisions about, no pop-up ads and things like that, and really understanding how to get something to people. And in a society of relative abundance, you need aesthetics and design and those kind of skills to get anything through.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I have just come from Mongolia where I did not see a lot of design. And here, everything needs to be beautiful, more beautiful than 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I'm interested, for Abigail, how much of the coursework, the stuff that people are going for, maybe they have the skills, but they want that design piece. Are you seeing a lot of...
Design is exploding. Design is far and away our biggest category, seconded by technology. I think that people are enamored with the idea of creating something out of nothing, which is very, very design-based, technology-based too. I also think design comes very organically with the collaboration, with the problem solving, that toolkit that you're referring to, that you then have forever. It's not understanding financial modeling 101. It's actually rewiring your DNA in some way to be better at pretty much everything.
So I just want to shift gears for a minute and talk a little bit about motivation, because these are wonderful ideas. They sound great. I'm sure they're wonderful examples. And yet reality is, whether we're talking about, a Stanford MOOC or, or 7th or 6th grade class or the after-school newspaper I volunteer at. I mean, attrition, motivation are just, I hang over students to pull words out of them. It's really a challenge. And I'm curious, for each one of you, what do you notice in terms of, are there big dropout rates? The MOOCs, gazillions of people sign up and teeny numbers ever finish. Doesn't mean that the experience isn't valuable. But here we're talking about reaching some goal in each one of these cases. What are you seeing in terms of motivation? Do you want to?
Sure. I'd say by and large, the students will say, and almost every time I ask a student this question, they'd say they'd far prefer to learn in this type of an environment than in a traditional classroom for a number of reasons. Number one, they can experience success. The 6th grader who comes in a 4th grade level feels dumber and dumber every day. If you can experience success, that's highly motivating. 2, for a lot of kids, it's anonymous. If you're in a modality where you're working online or an ARM model, even if you're working with collaboratively, you're clustered with kids who, based on the data we have, all have that gap. So there's nothing to be embarrassed about, and everyone's in that same place, and that's motivating too. That said, there are sometimes kids that they should be working online and they're not, and they're distracted or they're not working as we want them to. We try to redirect them, as you'd see in a traditional class. I think it's probably far more engaging than a traditional class, but I'm not going to tell you all 3,500 kids every minute of the day is locked in. What we are learning, though, which I think is one of the more interesting parts of our work, is because we get data every single day on student performance, we can begin to track what we call the pace of learning. We can see how quickly students are moving through the program. We can give them the opportunity to accelerate their own learning at home and pick up additional hours. And as we get better at this, we are going to develop metrics around motivation itself. We're going to see who are our least motivated 20% of students, and what kinds of interventions can we schedule for them to see if we can change that.
Or are you noticing from your data that motivation is a kind of, I was speaking with a teacher out in California who a student was doing, getting 40s on her math work, and then she was doing some work and then started getting it, and then the motivation just grew. I mean, is motivation more of a curve than some people have it, some people don't?
No,
is it situational?
We have, in our new model, we launched this new feature called Prove It. Whereas if we think you as a student don't know how to do something, but you think you do because you watched the video, you talked to your older sister, you taught yourself, whatever, you can sign up for an on-demand assessment, and if you get a perfect score, you get all the credit for mastering that skill without using up any class time. Miraculously, just before the end of every grading period, the number of kids Prove It shoots up because kids want to get the credits for those skills so that they can sort of improve their grade. Great. I mean, that picks up an extra 2 or 3 weeks of instructional time. So there are these tools and tricks you can sort of put into place to try to take advantage of those types of motivations.
Great. Now, Abigail, do you have a big dropout rate?
I mean, not 100% of the students complete their projects, which is how we define completing a class, but the entire model of the project is designed to increase engagement. So we're seeing anywhere from 10 to 30x what the MOOCs are seeing, because we're not delivering information.
Right, so the MOOCs are like 8 to 13%.
Yep.
So you're seeing?
Yes. So we're seeing anywhere from 30 to 80% completion, depending on the class. Which is incredibly high for the industry. Students are invested in their projects. It's like they've signed up, they've made a pact with the thousands of other students in the class. We talk a lot about the IKEA effect, which is, I don't know if it's a real thing, but it's basically falling in love with something that you made, no matter how dysfunctional and ugly it is, because you made it. I think that is a huge, huge driver of engagement. We know that a student is 3x more likely to complete a project if they've gotten feedback from another student around it. So do you have
feedback built into your?
Yep, students are paired with other students that are at the same level, or at the same stage of their project rather, randomly from all over the world to give and get feedback, which is a huge, huge, huge lever that we use for engagement.
And that is the whole kind of model, that very immediate feedback is what, when I was watching a classroom in Mongolia of an English teacher, she graded the students' papers for a test the moment they were done. Like if one student finished, she walked over and graded it in front of them. I thought that was really interesting, because everything we know about learning is that the immediate feedback of being able to figure out now, not 2 weeks from now, if you got it right or wrong. What do you notice in terms of motivation, even to bring this feedback into it?
In that, we're mostly offline in our experience, and so our students really are coming because they have very specific personal goals. They invest a lot of time and a lot of money. So, I mean, we find, our completion rate for our courses is around 97, 98%. I don't think that compares necessarily to the MOOCs or even Skillshare.
No, I mean, MOOCs are generally free. Yours are like $3,000, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
When we have a free event, the drop-off rate is probably similar to the MOOCs, right? People just don't show up. So there's a kind of like, you pay for it, you own it, you commit to it kind of thing that I think is a big dynamic of education. And I think even when we look at subsidizing and things like that, we always think it's very important for students to have skin in the game and to have a real reason why they're showing up. And as we get
money often works.
Money helps, enough? And the other thing is that when we do, especially our most intensive programs, we know that the students that have problems that are going to be the ones that are being less engaged, they're going to have trouble getting a job at the end. And so one of the things that we filter for most aggressively in the beginning is not what your background is or what your math ability is. It's really like, how motivated are you, and what do you have the right?
How do you test motivation?
Well,
I mean, how do you in your entrance?
There's actually a lot of people, like the professors, are working on this idea of grit. I think it's been in the news a bunch
Angela
lately.
Duckworth, yes.
Right, but for us, it's really about what your goals are and why you want to take the course and how you articulate those goals.
So do you require kind of an interview?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you require an interview to kind of understand the sense of clarity that they're getting what they're expecting, and they're know how much work is going.
Like aligning expectations and reality is like the most important way to have a successful class for us. And I would guess across the board in education, that's pretty much the truth, is that if students' expectations and what happens are closely aligned, and if students' abilities are closely aligned, and and all that kind of stuff, that's how you have a successful class. And it's when those things are getting misaligned that you really end up in trouble.
So Joe, film sounds just like a blast in there. I think just about every kid in the universe is like, yeah, I want to do that. But certainly it's hard work. Mm-hmm. And are there kids who kind of get there and think, oh, this was going to be like, the movies, and it's much more challenging? And if so, how do you deal with that is there a reality that hits for the kids?
Well, I think getting back to this idea of the motivation, I mean, the first and foremost thing that they understand is that it's relevant. If you're in day 2 of our course on the nonprofit side and you're in a class with Spike Jones, you get like, all right, like I'm being taught by a master here. Like, and you understand that the alumni last year shot a movie in Shanghai and you're probably going to go to Paris or something. Like there's a big sort of picture thing that allows them to say like, this is relevant, it's important, it's meaningful. I think we don't do enough to give teenagers opportunities for disappointment. I think we really fail young people when we allow them, there's and I forget her name right now, but there was this great article in Atlantic Monthly about the coddling culture. And I think depending on where you are, certainly in the Bronx, I think it's more about emphasizing that young people are disadvantaged or at risk. But, there's a reason that these neighborhoods keep churning out great athletes. And it's because when you're playing sports in the South Bronx, that coach is only interested in teaching you these skills and this practice and getting you really good. There's no self-esteem. There's none of this other bullshit, encroaching in that. It's just like, we're going to win, and then at the end of the game, we know we won and they lost. And if you lost, you have to pick yourself up, practice really hard again, get back on the court, and there's an expectation that is a viable process. It's okay to lose. And so I think the setbacks and the failures in our process around the filmmaking, which is a very tough task. Your actor doesn't show up. All of a sudden the bodega guy says, no, you can't use it, I changed my mind. Those kind of things. But it gives a teenager, I think, a rather unique opportunity these days into an adult experience adult life is all about managing obstacles and bumps in the road and keep moving ahead and persevering. So I think that those are actually great opportunities, and the failures and the mistakes and things like that. I mean, in our nonprofit program, 30 kids make a movie over the summer. They curate, only 10 of them we screen at Lincoln Center, and people are mortified. Like, oh my God, the 20 kids who made a movie and they didn't get to screen it and all this. And it's like, because we're preparing them for a real world experience. And those 20 kids don't drop out. They understand that that's a bit more of motivation. We shouldn't understand setbacks as putting out the fire of motivation. In some ways, I think it actually enhances their motivation because they want to get down. Like, they're ready to keep pushing and working hard.
So on the one hand, I'm hearing about these kind of skills, and film is a vehicle for teaching things that we all should know, or we hope that all our children know, in terms of, as educated and people who learn how to learn, because who knows what the jobs are going to be. And yet there's this kind of tension that we see now around this question of, should you be able to put all your energy just into the stuff that you're really, really good at and just fly with that? Or, as we're having, the Common Core is part of, the 40 plus states have enacted it, and we're going to see more and more kind of, standardized pressure to kind of meet across the curriculum, and that may be more from the teaching end than the learning end. But the presumption is that there are things that everybody needs to know. So is that a wrong-headed way to go? Is the nature of education, whether it's K-12 or higher ed or after, should we just, is it enough to pursue the stuff we're really, really good at, or do we need to push at our weaknesses?
I've always been against this idea of we shouldn't teach kids whatever because they're not going to use it in real life or in the world, because we don't know that for a fact. I had no idea I would be doing any of this in college, let alone out of college. I had no idea I'd be doing this. So I don't think you can predict so easily what should and should be in the mix, so to speak. I mean, people have to read. They need literacy. They need numeracy. You know, I think you always have to focus.
So passion versus competency.
You have to have those basic skills. That there's no question about that, and that can be measured. And I think there is some resistance to, you know, that being a focus. But we have to have those standards. Great.
So I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions here, and I want to start with a question that was submitted in advance, and this is, the question is, the diagnosis of kids with learning disabilities and attention deficit issues is on the rise. How do you propose teachers integrate these kids into the classroom and keep them engaged? I think this is probably for the two of you in the end.
Well, our current model for serving students with special needs is they get an individualized education plan, and everyone else is sort of in the batch process world. We actually think everyone should have an individualized education plan, and just because you have this label, you don't have a label, is kind of immaterial. And so in our model, we serve students with special needs in our model. They're in that space just like every other student is, and there's a special needs teacher who's in the space, and she has an iPad, and she sees where every student is, and she can walk around the room and provide extra support to those students and help other students along the way. So look, we have a model now where something like, I don't know what the number is, but a very low % of students who qualify for special needs end up graduating from high school. So we can no longer keep trying to solve this problem with inputs. Maybe they need a more refined IEP with more signatures and a lower ratio. And we need to sort of, again, rethink the delivery model. And I don't think that the delivery model has failed any group of students more than it's failed the students that you're describing.
And Joe, do you have students with ADD and ADHD?
Or
you don't know?
The thing that scares me the most these days is this big push to medicate every child. And there was actually a great article in the Times, I believe it was a couple days ago, about the rates of these diagnoses. And I meet in my line of work so many filmmakers, artists, really successful people who will tell me, like, thank God I was not a teenager now because I was that kid. It used to be daydreaming.
Right.
And now it's something wrong.
So is film a form of medication?
I don't understand.
Filmmaking. Can filmmaking be,
if you got energy to burn, you can jump in and, and be that guy. Yeah, I think it's attractive to those kids who are really anxious and want to get things going and do things. But, that's another panel. But I think we're seeing now in the Bronx, actually this was a population of young people. When I started working and living in Hunts Point 20 years ago, you didn't see this thing. And now it's being brought in as a resource through these very large federal mental health grants. So we're going to see more and more kids in the Bronx, being medicated, diagnosed with these kind of things. I don't know if that's progress.
Great. Question for the two of you in the middle. Can you comment on the paradox of choice for those in higher education, meaning we have an abundance of choice and an inability to choose?
Sure. I'm not really sure I agree with the inability to choose part. I think people are pretty paralyzed by what we call like the course catalog model. So yes, if you were trying to choose your major through the online options, you might just explode. But if you actually like turn that question a bit more inwards and just said, what do I want to learn tomorrow? I think it's pretty easy to decide. I think you experiment a lot. I don't think that there's one model that's right for everybody. So I have taken like a computer science class on 4 different platforms, and only one was successful for me. But I enjoyed that process. I learned more about myself making those choices than I would have.
So can you try out the classes before you take them?
You can take them for $20, and that's the whole amount.
Okay. Okay, so essentially. Do you want to respond to
that? We've stayed very, very focused based on our real mission, which is, we have sort of joked to our team, we have about 120 employees at this point, and the reason we get out of bed in the morning is not because we think about skills or higher education. It's really to help people feel less lonely and lost in their career path and really find meaning in their work and through that their life. And so, when you think about choice and you think about there's all of these options, yeah, that's a beautiful thing. But it's really about helping people find a community of peers and an interest group that they can then use as a way to connect to understand more about themselves.
So
and
the
to find a
social
path.
part of learning.
Huge, and
Yeah.
I bet you would
Yeah.
say the exact same
Yeah,
thing.
learning
that
stuff.
I think a huge part of why people even spend, $3,000 to come to class is to do it around other people who they feel like they'll somehow have a bond with. And we see it with graduates. We have almost 1,500 alumni of our long-form courses at this point, and we see the way they relate with each other. We see people coming in night after night for even like one-hour sessions, and it is as much about the social dynamic of connecting with peers as it is about getting some content delivered to you. And it's one of the reasons why I'm sort of a MOOC skeptic at the end of the day, is I think the socialization is really a huge part of what education is all about.
Well, here's a question that specifically for you, Jake. It says, how do you motivate adults to read the Odyssey?
Well, I think then you have to have the meta conversation of why should you read the Odyssey? And that's an interesting conversation to have, right? I mean, I think in a lot of ways that goes back to what is the purpose of education? Why do we need kids who are good at math, and why do we need people who can, design or do computer science or whatever? And it's really about what does society need out of education to continue to function and to grow and to improve and really, compete with the rest of the world.
That's a giant question. So Abigail, here's for the same person, a question for you. It's to Abigail, what is the importance of the PhD degree in the future of learning?
Of the
PhD degree.
PhD degree. What is the importance of it? Not very much. I mean, if you wanted to be a professor and you wanted to teach and you needed those credentials and that experience, but that is a shrinking number of people, where we see ourselves sort of targeting a market that is growing, people who don't want to be professors. They want to teach each other. Like, we all want to take a class on, knitting and talk about it. There'll never be a PhD in knitting, but I think it's actually a more valuable learning experience. Maybe there will be a PhD in knitting. I don't want to.
There probably
I don't want to
already
say
is.
that on camera.
Milan or
but-
something.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And here's so what is the role of traditional textbooks, print, in your educational system? And then there's a follow-up question, what has replaced the book for you? What is the most valuable educational tool in your system? So for each of you, the question essentially, do you still use textbooks? Do you use something else? Or what is the tool that is kind of the go-to tool that you use?
They're still reading text. And another thing that we pushed back on the Department of Education when we were designing the school was we purposely did not want to use, because this would have been obvious, to use in humanities only books and stories that have been made into films. Like, kids get right away, that's a kind of fake overlay, And so we wanted intentionally actually go the other way and just have kids develop a love of literature and a love of learning, and that skill set would enhance their palette in filmmaking, but it didn't have to be so obvious where in math class they would do film budgets and aperture and the camera, make all these sort of fake kind of connections, which a lot of these thematic schools actually, I think, do a poor job of sort of doing that.
So what's
And
your
then kids
favorite
check
book in
out.
the curriculum?
In my curriculum?
Yeah.
In the high school?
Yeah.
I like the autobiography of Malcolm X. I think it's a very cinematic book, and it's a great story, well told.
What about?
Since we're teaching very much, we have our own curriculum that we use. Now that curriculum
Is it online? Is it on
it's
paper?
primarily, I would say, online and through exercises and through the instructor. Almost everything we do is highly, highly interactive, and so it's not as much about reading text. There's also so many free resources and things online that we direct people to that it would probably be best to say that the web is what we use as our primary textbook. And a lot of our skills, especially programming, is all about not necessarily having it all in your head, but knowing where to find the answer to specific questions when you need them. And so teaching that skill, that technique of how you look for previous solutions to your problem is sort of what we teach.
Yeah, I was going to say the internet as well as the textbook that we use. We design each curriculum with the teacher, and it's a simple question: how would you have wanted to learn this skill if you were starting now? We have a great discussion about it. We package it up into a curriculum. They can pull in any resources they want. It can be a TED Talk. It can be an essay of their own. And that is the curriculum in its entirety.
Mitchell.
So for our model, we have over 300 skills on our skill map, from almost third grade math to 10th grade math. And we looked at over 50,000 lessons. Some of those are live lessons delivered by teachers, some are collaborative, some are independent, some are virtual. We chose the 12,000 we think are the best ones, and some of those are textbook-based lessons. I think what our sort of core innovation is if you take all the data about all those lessons and all the data about each student, you can't expect a teacher to sort of match each day for each student what they should use. So what our algorithm does is sort of take all that data and match what student would be most successful with which lesson each day and convert that into a daily schedule that gets operationalized.
So different tools for different kids.
At different times.
Different times.
Yeah.
Great. So here's a question. The pedagogical model that you can see no longer works, used to work. What changed? Are today's kids so different?
I think there's some assumptions in there I don't know if I would agree with. So, and we don't, you know.
So did the old education model only work for certain people, or did it not work at all, or did it work a little bit?
I mean to unpack that, I'm not really sure how we're defining worked. So if students who went to school, I don't know what the exact number is, but at a certain percent got the jobs that they wanted because they invested in that 4 years. If that's work, that stopped working because the job economy no longer works that way. If it's on a K through 12 level, I don't know how to speak to that.
Well, I mean, I guess for Joel, we're talking about kids who did school.
I mean, what changed was a lot of students who did okay to not that great in school were able to get jobs in manufacturing in the middle of the 20th century. And when those jobs disappeared and went overseas, doing okay wasn't good enough. That those jobs disappeared and required a higher level of skill acquisition in order to be successful in the later part of the 20th and now the 21st century. So it's not that the systems necessarily changed so much. It is the bar has been raised given automation and globalization.
A lot of those jobs I don't think people would necessarily want now. It seems like some of the emerging jobs are just a lot more interesting and fun and engaging.
Well, I think we have to be careful about that, right?
Okay.
Because there is a class of people, right? We're talking about people who went to fancy colleges, who now, like, instead of going to law school, want to do something that's more creative and more interesting, or instead of being a banker, right, or instead of, we're talking about very upper middle class, white collar professional kind of experience, right? Now, a lot of the trends around the changing nature of work that class of people are experiencing is being experienced at all different strata of society in slightly different ways. Like, work is changing. What is required of people is changing, and so education should change along with it. It's not going to be user experience designers and computer programmers as far as the eye can see across this country. Like, I mean, it would be awesome if that happened, but like, it's not going to happen.
But certainly, if we take the credential and the kind of traditional path, kind of move that out of the way for a minute, it certainly opens up opportunities for different ways of getting. There may be some very creative people that you have in your South Bronx school who may never be filmmakers, but because of the manner in which they learn, mm-hmm, are able to apply those skills in something that they would never have had access to. I mean, is that true or not true? I mean, what I'm saying is, if we're taking down the hierarchy a little bit, if we're taking down this kind of traditional path that everybody here is so eager to, crunch down, it's not just that smart kids with access to lots of fancy colleges are going to pour in. Yes, they will, but doesn't it democratize things a little bit?
It definitely democratizes things. I think the most important thing, though, is by matching the kid with the need or the adult with the desire, what you actually do is you create a much, much more efficient system, right? Where instead of spending $150,000 to get a degree that then you need graduate school just to even be a functioning member of society, you can do that for much less time.
But I suspect this matching issue is a big issue.
Huge. Because if you can be more efficient, you can save a lot of society's costs. And if you look at the trillions of dollars that are spent on education in this country, like that can really move the needle for local communities. It can move the needle at the state and the federal level, and it can completely change what other resources are freed up to then devote to other parts of society that need them as well.
So if you look on a basic level, I mean, probably everyone's kid here has laptops and iPads and iPhones. I mean, I've interviewed kids who have written papers on smartphones because they don't have laptops and such at home. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have an equipment issue in your school or not? I assume it's all available so kids don't have to worry about not having a camera.
Yeah, the issue with technology in a community like the Bronx is not so much access. It's the belief of, are the kids even able to use it? I mean, there's, smart boards in the Bronx that are just used as coat hangers.
Yeah,
like
sure.
It's there. And it's very hard, to engage people with expensive cameras if you're in a building where there's a metal detector. That's the technology that is prevailing over the culture of that school. So in our program...
And how big a stumbling block is that? I mean, how...
The expectation is the #1 determinant of success, I believe. There was a time where if you were a poor immigrant coming into a classroom in New York City public school, you were considered, you could learn. There was an expectation that you were going to learn. And I think that shifted dramatically. And I think that the expectation now is that we have a whole group of young people in New York City who just, for all these different reasons, cannot learn. And so we gear the whole system into that, backing into that reality that we create. We create that reality. High expectations, the bar higher is where the students go to.
But
that's where the motivation comes from, the engagement, the trust.
But it sounds as if the structure messes things up a little bit. I mean, I volunteer in a school, doing a school newspaper where they have an entire computer lab, but they will not let me install a Dropbox, so kids do not get to write their pieces on computer. They don't keyboard.
Right.
They write them on paper, and the computers are not even networked to one another.
Yep.
So the teachers have to go and use a thumb drive to collect each thing, which is crazy. So you've invested in all this technology, and it's essentially not available, so they don't learn to use it.
And that sends out a message: you're great, and you're here to learn, and let's go, right? I mean, these schools have wireless internet, but all the sites are blocked, so you can't do research on the internet the way a normal person would, because so many of these sites, YouTube, Facebook, I mean, they're all blocked because there's an inherent sense of distrust.
Great.
And that creates success, is that culture of the school.
Great. So I just want to finish up with just a kind of a question to each of you, is that, there's so, I was in a lecture that Eric Lander gave up at MIT, and he told this funny story about, it was about Mendel, the geneticist, and he told about how Mendel's paper outlining how the genetics work was actually in Darwin's library. But Darwin never read it because he could tell that the paper wasn't slit. It was never opened. And I couldn't help but imagine how useful Mendel's paper would have been to Darwin. And, today it's hard to miss a big story like Mendel because we have almost the opposite problem. We have too much information, and we get it all at once. And what I'm interested to hear from each of you is, with so much crosstalk, so much new stuff every single day, what is getting lost or missing from the conversation that you think is going to matter a lot in the future?
I think one big thing that I see is I think a lot about this in terms of what are the a priori assumptions that are just wrong that kind of sit there and we talk around. Mm-hmm. And I think a big thing here is, and I really applaud actually, because a lot of times when we have high schools, we celebrate the success of the high school based on how many people go to college. And when I get in these conversations, a big thing that I care a lot about is and it's not that I'm anti-college or anything like that, but there's this assumption that college is the way to a better life. Mm-hmm. And you made a comment about how it's correlated. Right? But correlation is not the same thing as causation, and I think one of the things that's really being challenged right now is what does that correlation really say, and is it just a rising tide that had lifted all the boats in the 20th century and is not doing that anymore? And so I think the key thing is that this assumption that, like the assumption that really fueled the last decade, which was that owning a home was a way to get people vested in their society, mm-hmm.
Which
led to the housing crash.
Sure.
Very similar to that is, everybody needs a college degree and should take on $40,000, $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 of debt in order to get that. Yep. Is a key assumption that is almost a religion in this country that needs to be carefully looked at if we're going to continue to be able to operate as a society.
Abigail.
I think something that gets lost a lot in the discussion of online learning specifically is the difference between the problem of access and the actual structure of learning. So, the traditional MOOCs that we hear about, that I'm sure most of us are taking classes in, have done an amazing job of making traditional learning models accessible to more people, and that should be celebrated. it's absolutely wonderful. But what I think would be a major missed opportunity in this, like, education trend would be to assume that just because it worked in college, if it worked in college, scaling it up and making it more accessible is actually changing anything about the way that people learn. I think decentralizing, bottom-up student, all the collaboration, the project-based stuff, if that gets swept away in this, and that doesn't actually change the way classrooms work on every level, it would be a huge, huge loss.
Right.
So I think there's two things. One is, despite what you might hear and read about, very, very little has actually changed in K-12. Yep. If you walk into any school in this city or in this country, you'd see one teacher, you'd see 30 kids, maybe you'd see 3 computers with cobwebs in the back of the classroom, and it's operating just as it did back in the middle part of the 20th century. And we have to just sort of understand that, acknowledge that as much as it may seem like the world is changing, and it is outside of K-12, it brings to the second point, which is that K-12 is so resistant to change. Structurally, we have statutes, we have regulations, we have contracts, we have just mindsets, we have bureaucracy. We have all these different ways that sort of take the old way of doing it and just keep it locked in so many different ways. And it's going to take a concerted, thoughtful, comprehensive effort, not just to say, well, kids should do MOOCs or kids should learn online or, free the knowledge, but very thoughtful ways on sort of redesigning not only different models, but also thoughtful ways to actually get them disruptively introduced into the existing structure.
I think we always have to get back to what's the motivation, whether it's an educational program, whether it's a school, like why are we even doing this? And what I hear oftentimes, successful nonprofits that are involved in education or schools that are working with young people, you literally hear something like, well, our school is successful and it'll keep kids out of jail. So if that's the motivation, if that's the guiding principle, if that's the lens that you're bringing to that interaction, that has to be reassessed. And it's a very simple thing. And I agree. Public education is not a speedboat. It's a battleship. It turns very slowly. But we should be focused on how to get that to turn because it's an incredible resource. And I think there's a tradition there that could be refreshed if we were to look at really the motivation of what we're expecting young people to do today.
Great. Terrific. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion. Great questions from the audience. Really appreciate you all coming. Thank you, guys.
When I'm asked what advice I would give to young women, I often say, don't take my advice. That's the advice I would give you, because the important thing is that you listen to your wisdom that's inside yourself. Do what you love. Do what you forget what time it is when you're doing it because you love it so much. Find your unique talents. Find the people who make you feel smart and make you feel good, and hang out with them, because we all need that kind of support.